Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about this particular rook and pawn endgame. We're going to be talking about the difficulties of it, what the overall assessment is, and how we should be playing this endgame from both sides. This is a rook and pawn endgame. This is a 3-on-2. It's a very common endgame that comes up at the highest levels, and of course at that club level, where a lot of you are going to be playing this particular endgame. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, for starters, the first thing that we have to understand when we're playing an endgame like this is we have to understand the overall assessment, and then we have to understand sort of where do we put our pieces, what transitions do we want to try to achieve, and more importantly, what transitions do we want to avoid. We want to know how to press with the white pieces. We also want to know how to draw with black. So for starters, the overall assessment of this position is with best play, it should be approximately equal. It should be a draw. This is an endgame that black should draw, and as a matter of fact, on the Grandmaster level, it's such an easy draw to obtain, like the technique behind it, that normally they don't even play it out. Now, on the club level, you should absolutely play this endgame out every single time, because there are a lot of ways that black can go wrong if he doesn't know exactly what he's doing. So, when I analyze an endgame like this, the first thing that I want to look at is what can this endgame turn into? Basically, if we make some exchanges, what would the assessment be? Would the assessment be different? What would the assessment be, and how would we play it? So let's start with like a big change. Like what would happen if the rooks came off the board? So if all of a sudden the rooks just kind of disappeared off the board, well, let's take a look at that position, and let's take a look at what the assessment of that position would be. So if the rooks came off the board, we would end up with something like this, a king and 3 pawns versus a king and 2 pawns. And what would be the overall assessment of this position? Well, the overall assessment of this particular position is white should just be winning. The 3-on-2 with no rooks on the board is an easy win for white. And the reason behind that is because in this particular kind of king and pawn endgame, all we have to do to win the game is create a passed pawn. We have to get our king in front of our pawns, like say king f2, king e3, king e4, and then start creating a passed pawn with f2, g4, f5, etc. Now, black's best bet, like let's just say, like for example, king f2, king f7, and then we have king e3, king f6, king f4, we centralize our king. Black's best bet is to keep his pawns sort of where they're at and make white come to him, hoping that he'll run out of oxygen at some point, and maybe it'll be difficult for white to make progress. But it's not practical. Like there's actually no practical solution here for black to actually play for a draw. For example, like let's say that they play g5 check. This actually should hasten the problem. And the reason that this hastens the problem is because it's actually putting your pawns in a position where they're more vulnerable for the white king to get to them. So right now, like the zone of the g-pawn would be f5, e5, and f7. But of course, the zone of any pawn in a king and pawn endgame is actually the base zone. So when you have h7 to h6, then that will become the zone of the pawn. So g5 is only a relevant zone if that pawn moves from, say, h7 to h5. But that would make the position incredibly easy. Like if king e4 and then say we played h5, we can now target the zone of the g5 pawn by simply playing pawn to g4. And now all we have to do is get our king to one of these 3 squares to win. So right now we'd be threatening gh5, and on a move like, say, pawn to h4, all we have to do is get our king to the zone, and it's over. We can take the pawn on g5. So understanding these basic endgame concepts will be a nice shortcut to winning if somebody decides to push their pawns against you when you're trying to obtain your passed pawn. But overall, it's not even necessary. Like all of this, itty bitty technique stuff isn't necessary. In this situation, even this type of technique isn't necessary. For example, after king e6, the easiest is just to play something like g3 and just create a passed pawn. Just play g3 and f4 and create a passed pawn. After king f6, we just make the passed pawn. We play f4, g takes f4, g takes f4, and then we would have something like king to e6, f5 check, king f6, king f4, and we would just march this pawn up the board. And eventually we'd achieve something like this. And it doesn't matter if he plays h6 or h5. We can use the 6th rank rule position to win the game by forcing black to move in a tempo situation where he doesn't want to. So for example, h6, we would just simply play king g6, giving him that escape square, setting up 6th rank rule. We would have h5, h4, forcing black to move, and once black plays his king here, we're simply going to play our king here, and the game is going to be over. And we would just do the exact same thing if he played h5. h5, king g6, h4, and then h3, forcing him to move. King e7, king g7, winning. So that would be how we handle that. Now, of course, it's a little bit more resistance if they don't move their pawns at all, like king f7, king f5, king g8, king e6, king f8, but for the most part, same strategy. Now we can just play f4. We can even eventually play f5. We can obtain the exact same 6th rank rule by just pushing our pawns all the way up the board. We can play f5, g4, etc., etc. So, like, the only thing they can try to do to cross us up is at some point they can play a timely h5. So, like, king g8, let's say king e7 to get at the zone of the g7 pawn, king h8, king f7, and now a timely h5, but now we would just play h4, king h7, f5, king h6, and then simply f6 takes, and then we get to the zone of the h-pawn and we win it. And that would be the easiest possible win. But needless to say, all these king and pawn endgames, just from the outset, all these king and pawn endgames are easy wins for white. White shouldn't have any problem winning from those positions. So going back to this, our initial endgame setup, we have the rook and 3 pawns versus the rook and 2 pawns. What about other positions that we could get to? Like, what about pawn transitions? What if we exchange certain sets of pawns? This is where things get extremely difficult, because most of the pawn exchanges that can happen here are going to favor black. It's going to make it much, much easier for black to draw. Any, like, 2-on-1, for example, is going to be much closer to a draw. So, like, let's say that we have this 2-on-1. This is a really simple draw. This particular 2-on-1. There's tons and tons of checking distance from the side. There's just not a whole lot that white can do. Like, if he transitions further to create a passed pawn, those endgames are going to be draws as well. We're going to reach like a classic Philidor draw or something like that. It's going to be a problem. So these are easy draws. Okay, so what about 2-on-1 offset? That's another option. We could reach something like that. What about that exchange? Well, this is a little bit more dicey. It's a little bit harder to draw. It's very, very, very difficult to win. But this is a little bit closer. Like, maybe this is a little bit better than a 3-on-2. The 3-on-2 is nearly impossible to win. This is, like, just maybe mostly impossible. Like, mostly it's difficult, but maybe you can press from here with white. So this is a little bit more favorable. You actually have a passed pawn, but still, I mean, this is questionable. So this isn't even all that helpful, even if you can get this. Now, what about, like, what are the winning transitions that you can try to achieve? Well, one winning transition would be if you got something like this, 2-on-none. So somehow if you managed to trade 2 of his pawns for 1 of yours, and you kept 2 protected, like you kept 2 connected passed pawns, now you're winning. But what's interesting is if those pawns are split, so if we have the exact same situation and you have split pawns, this is not winning. This is a draw. So this is a theoretical draw. So keeping all of those transitions in mind, if we go back to this initial starting position, there are so many things that white has to avoid, it makes it nearly impossible to make progress without obtaining a known theoretical draw, which is why this position is a theoretical draw. So, for example, if black just hangs out on the side, gets his checking distance, takes his rook and puts it on the long side of the pawn. We call this the long side of the pawns because there's the most distance between the king and the rook as you can possibly get. So we're taking the rook and putting it on the long side. And of course, another thing is, like, the king a lot of times will belong on the short side. So, like, even if the king transitioned all the way over to h6, that would be the short side of this potential passed f-pawn. So as long as the black king is on the short side and the rook is on the long side, winning these endgames is nearly impossible. That's part of the reason that the endgame with split pawns is actually a draw, because there's a lot of short side, long side situations where you have checking distance from the side and it just becomes impossible to make progress. So here, the question is, how do we make progress? Could we play a move like h4 to make progress? This is a typical type of attempt in any endgame, any rook and pawn endgame, or even king and pawn endgame, is to move the h-pawn, because the h-pawn isn't worth that much. So again, if we could trade the h-pawn for, say, the g-pawn, this would be an improvement in our position. As previously stated, that position's a little dicey. We have some chances to win in that position if we can trade the h-pawn for the g-pawn. When the h-pawn moves forward, we're just not risking that much because the h-pawn only controls 1 square at a time, whereas something like the g-pawn controls 2. But in this case, we would have almost no way to win if black just responds to h4 with h5. The problem is once we've got in h4, h5, the only way that we can make progress with our pawns in the future is to eventually play g4. But as soon as we play g4, our opponent is going to play h captures g4, and it doesn't matter if we take back with the rook, the king, or the pawn. All of those endgames are theoretical draws. As soon as we play rook takes g4, even without the g-pawn, that's a draw. And as soon as we play f takes g4, we have a 2-on-1 situation where we just have the one potential passer. It's a potential passer. It's not a pure passed pawn yet. And it's not even a very good potential passer. It would be an h-pawn potential passer. It wouldn't be all that great. So that's going to be an easy draw. So once we play h4 and they respond with h5, we basically have no winning chances anymore. So after rook a8, what would we have to do to try to win? Well, we could maneuver our king up. We could play something like king g3, and of course, hoping for rook exchanges, hoping for things like that. They could play king f7, we could play king f4, and at this point, black would obtain the draw by playing a move like rook a2. This effectively forces our king backwards and says, hey, you didn't make any progress. That rook is hitting the g2 pawn. We can't move it forward without losing the h2 pawn, so we're going to have to bring our king back. We didn't make any progress with our king. And then the rook would go back and say, okay, what's your plan? What are you really doing? Are you going to move forward with your king, or are you going to do something else? So now we have to do something else. We know that h4 can be met with h5, so we can try maneuvering our rook a little bit. We could play rook f4, say king g6, keeping that king kind of near the short side. Rook back to b4, king back to f7, rook b7, king back to g8, and then eventually we got to try to do something. So again, if we move our king up, king f4, rook a2, we're not making progress. We got to bring our king back. So again, h4, normal maneuver. They're going to play h5, but it's a little different now because at least the king is back a little bit further, but still, we're not going to get anything out of this. We're going to play something like rook b5, g6, rook back to b7. We're cutting the king off on the 7th. This is really the most you could get out of a position like this. There's a possibility that you can sneak your king in for some type of sneaky mate. So you should at least give it a shot, but if he just plays rook a2, you're not playing king f4 without rook g2. So you could play king h3, and again, just rook a3, and you're not playing g4 without hanging your pawn on f3. So you're not going to make progress here. So now we're going to have rook b4, rook c3. You can try again, just doing some rook maneuvers or something. Rook f4, king g7. You could try g4, but after hg4, king g4, you're not even winning this if they lose the g-pawn. So if they give you the g-pawn for free, this is still a draw. So that is basically the 3-on-2. That's how we play it. If you're playing the attacking side, bring your king up, try to make rook exchanges. Eventually, you could play something like h4, h5, try to make progress like that. Try to check with your rook in front, gain some position with your rook. There's different ways you can try to play for a win. Overall, if black plays absolutely correctly, if he just takes his rook and gets it to the long side of that pawn, you're not going to have any real way to make progress, and black should be able to obtain the draw. And of course, if you're playing the black side, that's the strategy. Get the rook to the long side of the pawn. Get that checking distance. Prevent white from making progress. When the king goes to f4, bring that rook to a2. Make that king come back. Say you're not going to make progress without making some sort of pawn exchange or some sort of concession, which is going to lead to one of these other theoretical draws. So anyways, I hope you found that video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.